Hello and welcome back to Holley History, where we discuss what you want to hear. This is Nick again today. I'm the only one discussing this topic, so unfortunately you're left with my voice and my research, I guess you could say. We're continuing our series on genocide and kind of why it happens, the foundations of it, and what to really think about it. And last episode we discussed the four conditions of genocide, kind of why it happens, maybe why also it fascinates us as humans to read about it and study it. I wanted to do in this episode today more how you get average people to do this stuff, because we talked about Chirot and McCauley and why not kill them all, how they talk about that this is kind of normal behavior for humans, that under the right circumstances humans are willing to, as they say, quote unquote, kill by category. But they also discuss that there are certain limitations placed on humans that prevent this kind of thing from happening. For every one example you can go find of mass killing and genocide, you can probably find another example where mass killing and genocide could happen, but it didn't. And there's a few reasons why this isn't, more common than it is. There's codes of honor. We have international law after World War II about this kind of thing. We have certain kind of restrictions placed in laws and governments in different various countries. Economic relationships is another example. You are less likely to commit mass killing and genocide if you have a positive economic relationship with another country. If it's benefiting both groups, sometimes you can avoid mass killing and you can draw cultural connections. That idea of cultural diffusion sometimes in a positive way can prevent mass killing and genocide. But for the same reason, though, for those same reasons, you could also get to genocide if that economic relationship turns sour, if the code of honor is gone, if that international law is gone, if the law within your own country is gone. But we ended last episode talking about ideology, and the ideology being a dangerous component of mass killing and genocide and getting people to commit these things. And the authors offer up in the 20th century in particular that some ideologies are far more prone to committing genocide than others, and that is one of the bigger reasons why this is not more common than it. It's a hard way to kind of talk through that, because here in one sense they're arguing, and I agree, that mass killing and genocide is common, but that it doesn't happen more often than it does. And they offer this up in an excellent quote from in their book. It's kind of another long one, sorry, but I think they do a much better job of explaining it than I certainly can. So why genocide and mass killing doesn't happen more often than it already does. And they say third, and this is the beginning of the quote, third and most important today is ideology. So they're speaking about the 20th century. Back to them. Some ideologies are highly conducive to genocide, and others are not. Moral codes are ideological, and some codes are more conducive to violence than others. So they then go on to talk about, like in certain biblical times, that moral code, the religious code, can be certainly, lead to more genocide and mass killing because you have that core belief there. And then they kind of move on back to the 20th century because, let's face it, that's what we're really, more shocking, because like I said in the first episode, you could sort of write off that older killing to, it's a more violent world. It's the 20th century ones that we think we've moved past that, but with the right conditions, we really haven't. So back to Chirot and McCauley here, quote, anti-individualistic, strong communitarian ideologies, when combined with utopian certitude and an exalted sense of mission, led to the worst genocidal conflicts of the 20th century. Such ideologies could again support genocide in the future. If ruling ideologues believe that it is possible to purify their world and achieve perfection by force, and that it is necessary to rid themselves of all real and potential enemies, mass murder is only one crisis away. And that's the end of their passage there. That one is so profound to me, because if you think about the last episode and those conditions of genocide, that quote really wrapped it all up in one. If you think about the Soviet Union, if you think about Nazi Germany, Mao Zedong in China, Pol Pot, Cambodia, if you think about those ideologies and those mass killings, they really hit the nail on the head there. The authors of Why Not Kill Them All, Chirot and McCauley, they really bring home the idea that those ideologies, the threat to my ideology, the threat to like that perfect system that I'm trying to create, that threat of pollution, that journey for purity, if anything's a threat to that, That's led to the worst genocides of the 20th century. But we still have to beg the question, though. How do average people do this to each other? How did these leaders get the members of their country to commit these acts? There's a bunch of different reasons that the authors offer up. And I don't want to be just, picking on, I keep bringing up the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Mao China, things like that. I keep bringing those examples up, but I also want to, I talked about Native Americans in the United States earlier on. In the first episode, we talked about the Europe in the 16th century, the Protestant religious wars. There's examples of genocide everywhere, but the 20th century, I think, definitely goes more the ideological route rather than the religious one or convenience route of the United States. So there are plenty of examples. I don't want to just be picking on the same ones, but their work definitely centers a lot of it around the 20th century. So that's why I think I keep going to those examples, because they're maybe the easiest to talk about and the most widely known. So that's kind of why I've been gravitating towards that. But how do average people do this to each other? People, when we talk about Nazi Germany in class, a lot of times the students are always profound. Like, how do you get average people to go along with this, to look the other way? And the last portion is, how do you get them to take part in it? How do you get them to become willing executioners? Because at the end of the day, the people committing these crimes, a lot of them have families. They're fathers, right? Committing these mass killings, and how do you get this to happen? So it really is shocking when you think about it. These are average people doing these awful acts, and not that far away in history. Let's think about the Holocaust. That's, some of us have grandparents or great-grandparents, if they're still with us, that were alive during this. These are people you can see, you can hear, you can listen to them on these things, and it's not that far away in our past. And here's the shocking part. Under the right circumstances, and this is uncomfortable to think about, we could all be perpetrators or victims of genocide and mass killing. And I'm going to spend a lot of time in this because it gets to the heart of the matter of how this stuff happens. We laid it out sort of from the top down in the last episode, but Chirot and McCauley offer up a few reasons as to how you get humans to do this. Number one, organization is a huge piece of mass killing. They talk about how you get not normal is the wrong word, how you get a mass killing to go into a prolonged genocide. And the first step is organization. And that organization has to play on human emotion, which legitimizes the killing. This reminds me of revenge from one of the first 4 conditions of genocide. They point out that humans, we don't really like violence, the vast majority of us, over extended periods of time, especially because it reminds us of our own mortality. It reminds us that one day that's going to be us, that one day our life comes to an end. And you think about this, if you have people who can't stand the sight of blood, right? The people that they can't stand watching violent films, they can't even get blood drawn at the hospital. Violent acts, we can certainly be capable of committing them, but over long periods of time, it begins to really put the strain on us. And I'll provide a few examples in just a second. But of course, there's, examples where you can say, oh, what about serial killers, right? But we're talking about the average human, right? The average human for prolonged mass killing, certainly short mass killings, as in the riots and things like that, the groupthink, that whole thing. The quick killing, yeah, humans are capable of that on a quick scale in an instant. But the prolonged mass killing, the genocides of the 20th century, you have to have some kind of organization behind that for that to continue. Let's look at the Nazi death squads, the Einsatzgruppen. After a while, when in the beginnings of the Holocaust and World War II, there's accounts of the Einsatzgruppen and these guys not being able to handle it. And that in large part is because the way that they're carrying out their mission is in close quarters. They are doing this with the small arms, machine guns. The gas chambers are a thing of the future, and that sort of killing on that large level. And the guys just can't handle it. Himmler himself has trouble when he visits some of these sites because, the digging of the pits, sometimes they're just throwing these bodies in these pits, and the guys can't take it. And over this prolonged period of time, they're beginning to break down. Stories of guys vomiting, losing their nerve, refusing to do it. Alcohol's common. Alcohol is one of the most common things that you read throughout different episodes of mass killing. They get just stark drunk to get themselves to be able to do this stuff. I remember the story of a Soviet woman who was in the forces. The Soviets fully integrated women into their forces, pilots, snipers, all kinds of things. And she was interrogating a member of the Einsatzgruppen, I believe, or I could not remember, but it was a German soldier under some circumstances. And she's interrogating this guy, and she gets very intoxicated before and just tortures him, eventually killing him. And she didn't feel bad about it in her interview or her writing. So alcohol and drug abuse certainly plays a role into getting people to do these mass killings. Anything to sort of dull the senses. But if you look at the mass killings of the 20th century, they all have organization. The authors talk about how do you get that quick riot to go into prolonged mass killing? It needs organization. When you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., which the last time I was there, I believe, was a 10th grader, and you look at the sheer scale of records that the Germans kept, how organized they were. I talked in last episode about how they would divert resources away from the war effort to continue, the final solution, to continue this quest to get rid of the pollution that, they saw as the Jewish threat and other groups. Another example of the organization you see is the training that these people go through, the dehumanization through things like propaganda, through news, through media, different outlets. The Nazis were experts at this. The Soviets were very good as well. And to dehumanize that enemy. And then we kind of go back to those 4 conditions of genocide. This organization, to get people to do these awful things, has to play on a few human emotions. And when you go back to the 4 conditions of genocide, things like a sense of justice, a sense of fairness, a sense of fear, anger, those all play a role in getting people to do this. You'll see these, like I said, the authors call them frenzy-like killings throughout history quite often. They're very deadly because you get those emotions that come into play. And one of the thoughts of this is the burning of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 20s. It was one of the wealthiest communities of African Americans in the entire country, and over 300 people died. 10,000 people were left homeless. Large numbers of Americans went and destroyed this African American community in this frenzy-like emotions, and it's one of these things in our history that very few people actually know about. But that took place over a short time. Eventually, those emotions wear off. If you bring organization into this to play on those emotions, whether it be propaganda, through dehumanization of the other, the fear of pollution, you play on those emotions of the human mind, but you have the consistent organization to have it go forward. So when you look back at the Einsatzgruppen early days, they begin to realize we can't continue this sort of killing in these close quarters. So that's when you get things like, the gas chambers, various other ways, the crematoriums in these camps, because the people can't take it. So these 20th century mass killings, which I know we've been focusing on a lot in these genocides, the large reason that these can happen is because these organizations, I should say, governments had these organizations to overcome these barriers to get humans to do this. So there's a lot of human barrier to do this. Like I said at the beginning, we have an aversion to blood. We have an aversion to violence. So these governments and these systems and these leaders had to figure out ways to overcome those natural, human reactions. Some of the ways they did this, like I said, were, fairness, propaganda, that sense of justice, play on that anger, play on those feelings and emotions, but you have to do it in a way that you can extend it over a long period of time. And when you do this, the killing becomes, over time, less and less personal. It's normalized. It's brutalized. It's part of an order you are given. It's expected of you, and in certain cases, even rewarded with rank or what have you. Studies are shown that humans, have a far more likely chance to commit awful acts if they're given an order. If an authority figure gives you that order, you're much more likely to commit an awful atrocity. One example of this is the Milgram Experiment at Yale. They found out that, the authors talk about this in their book, McCauley and Chirot. They talk about how people were really likely to commit these brutal, awful, they had basically a button on one side. They would ask people questions. If they answered wrong, they would deliver a shock. And in some cases, the shock was getting up so high that it was just incredible. Would even kill people. And the people were doing a good job of acting on their side of the wall. And If given an order, humans are very likely to commit some awful thing. One need only look at the Nuremberg trials. The common defense there was, I was ordered to do this, I was part of the system, and that defense did not work, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But we are trained, even when you're a kid, to take, you have to respect authority, you have to respect the wishes of your parents, teachers, police officers, authority figures. And if these people that you trust in many cases, that you sometimes look up to, are telling you that this is okay, it's normal, or then you go beyond that into that fear, that pollution, that anger of they deserve it, they did this, they did that idea of public executions, that the victim deserves almost what they have coming to them, and it's normalized, you can kind of get through this stuff. And you need only go look at interviews of perpetrators of mass killing, how they explain themselves. They'll often cite these things. I was ordered, it was just normal, it was something you were ordered to do. But there's another component that kind of comes into this that I often think about, and threats will also work quite well too. The idea that your family could be harmed if you disobeyed that order is very profound. And at Nuremberg, they established the idea of the Nuremberg trials after World War II to bring the Nazis to justice. That is, it's established that if you have an order that is immoral and wrong in international law today, you are expected to disobey it no matter the consequence. Now, personally, I believe that, you should have that rule in place. We should have that high benchmark that we all try to hit as humans in modern society, and we try to live up to that. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult to hit that. If you're in that situation where it's not just your life, but the lives of your family that could be in danger if you don't follow this order, humans have I don't know how I would handle that situation. I pray I'm never in that situation, obviously, but that's a tough mark to live up to. And would it work as a defense today in war crimes, mass killings, genocides? Probably not. It probably wouldn't live up to that. But it's still, no matter how you slice and dice it and look at it, that's tough. If you are under threat of being killed if you don't carry out this act, or your family, that also plays a role into it too. Because in these systems, if you disobeyed that order, it's not, like I said, it's not just you, it's others, and you could, in many cases, you just disappear. Nobody hears from you, sees from you again, that kind of thing. So that is a challenge. That is a challenge that I think any kind of mass killing or genocide will have that as a component along the line. But I want to come back to this idea of justice and fairness as a role in the motivation for killing for these average people, governments and organizations using this as a component to get average people to commit awful acts, to overcome some of those barriers we discussed. You're just more likely to harm another if you feel that person deserves it or has legitimacy, whether it's, like we said, through that order, or it's that sense of justice and fairness. If you think about it, when we make a poor choice in our lives, no matter what age we are, I mentioned this in the first episode, our first reaction is to either try to excuse it or justify it somehow, to explain what you did. And it's just another example of simple human nature coming into play in these grand scales and gears of history and mass killing and genocide, that you can see these behaviors in everyday human interaction, but how when we come to mass killing and genocide, Chirot and McCauley discussed this as well, that these behaviors translate into these grander killings and genocides throughout history. And I mentioned this earlier, that you can see in interviews with people down the road long after these genocides have been committed, the perpetrators anyways, the actual killers most of the time are not willing to talk about this at all. They're just not willing to discuss it. If they are willing to discuss it, what you're usually going to see is they're going to feed you back a lot of times. If they haven't come to the conclusion that what they did was wrong, if they're still going to try to excuse it or dismiss it, that they'll feed you the lines of rhetoric that were so ingrained in them at the time of the killing, the legitimacy behind it that was put into them, the dehumanization, all of those things. And they'll point out all the wrongs that the victim group did to their group. There's that retribalization theme again, throughout history. And they'll be able to quickly point those out and constantly name it. Like, this happened to my group, so, we're going to continue to just do this. My mind always goes right to a documentary called Death in Gaza. Now, while this may be, you may not put this in the category of genocides, right now it's still quite controversial. Definitely war like a situation with mass killings, but Death in Gaza was about the Palestinian-Israeli relations. Like I said, this doesn't exactly fit the 20th century stuff we've been talking about with the ideological genocides, but you have conflict of religion here, which definitely could fit into somewhat Chirot and McCauley are talking about. Not saying either of these groups are committing genocide. I don't want that to come through this way, but certainly a piece of human emotion that I remember from this documentary was they go into the homes of like Israeli families and Palestinian families on either side. And, perfectly normal family, you're seeing what you expect, kids playing. And then one of the interviewers will ask the kids kind of, what do you think of the Israelis if it's a Palestinian family? And the answers will be like, they're dogs, I don't like them. And if you go into the Israeli homes, it's the same reaction. They're terrorists, they're awful people, I don't understand why they're this killing. And they're perfectly okay to justify what their organizations or governments will do to the other group because of these long memories, these long pasts that invoke a sense of justice and fairness for what you're about to do to the other group. So kind of back to, how these people down the road will talk about their behaviors. I remember watching an interview with a former member of the Einsatzgruppen. He's an old man. And this was one of these guys who just was not willing to, I don't want to use the word apologize, but he hadn't come to the conclusion that what he did was wrong yet. He's an old man at this point. And he cited, the lines of rhetoric from the Nazi line that there was an international Jewish conspiracy and that they were trying to, rid the Bolsheviks from Eastern Europe. And we talked about those other German veterans that did the same thing in the documentary from the first episode. But these people will have, so if they have not come to grips that what happened was wrong or that they took part in it, they'll still excuse their behavior using that idea of justice and fairness and that it had legitimacy. Those long senses of history and past wrongs that what I did was okay. Or there's the classic, I had no choice, like we talked about with Nuremberg. And another barrier you have that governments have a hard time getting ordinary people to commit these atrocious acts is when it comes to women and children or weaker groups of people. It is very difficult. If you are committing a mass killing or a war crime against prisoners of war, military-age males, throughout history, those are very, very common. They happen quite a bit, and you can almost justify that a little more clearly as they're a threat. They have to be eliminated. We can't, take this risk. It's all business, right? That idea of convenience. But when you introduce women, children, or like I said, weaker groups of people into the equation, this is where the governments and organizations have the hardest time. Now, everything that's been mentioned, the ideas of justice, fairness, long historical memories, fear of pollution, those are all play into getting people to do this. But this is obviously the more difficult piece. And I want to talk about the U.S. case kind of here. In the Philippine-American War, many people don't know a lot about this. Found in the Spanish-American War, after the United States clears the Philippine Islands of the Spanish fleet and forces, there's actually an insurrection that the Filipinos create. And this is because that, the Philippine people were in large part promised their independence if they helped the Americans defeat the Spanish, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, the famous Filipino leader who liked to call himself the George Washington of the Philippines. And this is one of these conflicts that Americans know very little about. It happens right after the Spanish-American War, 1898, 99, all the way into the 20th century. The Filipinos then launch a quest for independence from the Americans. The Americans simply determined that, we can't risk giving these islands their independence because, number one, another European power could swoop in and take them and have those military bases, and then where are we left with? So we have to keep it because they're probably not strong enough to fight off any kind of major defense from a European power. Most notably, the Germans were kind of in the area already, kind of looking at the prospect of getting some bases there. So that's the first reason. The second reason you have is, the attitude these people are not civilized enough to govern themselves, right? They'll descend into anarchy, and then where are we left? We need to help them achieve this sense of civilization. A lot of parallels to the Native American days of the West wars and the Indian boarding school idea. So it was sold as, we're doing this for their own good, and anything that we have to do is just like that idea of a means to an ends to civilize these people and kind of bring them into the fold of civilization and the United States. It doesn't matter if they gave their consent to be governed. It doesn't matter that they want their self-determination to determine the future of a nation. We have to bring these people into the fold of civilization, if, by force. And what you see in the Philippines is almost like this early Vietnam War kind of situation where these Filipinos just are fighting this guerrilla-style jungle war, and the Americans are having a tough time with it. And you just have these brutal acts committed on both sides. Granted, the Filipinos will do some awful things to American troops, and it's just violence breeds more violence on both sides. Another scenario that can be thrown into this are Native Americans within the United States, the continental United States, that we're moving them for their own good. That idea of convenience we talked about in the first episode. We're going to civilize them for their own good. So there's some parallels between that and the Philippines, and certainly on the frontier of American society. People lived in quote unquote fear of Native American attacks, and Native Americans lived in fear of Americans. So you have like this idea of violence breeding more violence on the frontier. But to bring it back to the idea of women and children, in the Philippines and in the United States and Native Americans, you have constant brutalization and death of women and children on all sides in these mass killings. But I want to focus on obviously the U.S. mass killing of indigenous peoples in the United States and in the Philippines. When you have this brutalization, this constant system of violence, it's much easier, coupled with the ideas of justice, fairness that we've talked about already, to commit these awful acts against women and children. And the same kind of thought applies to the ones we've talked about with the Nazis, the Soviets, all the groups we've already mentioned. But I wanted to bring it to the U.S. example. Now, granted, this is on a different, time period than the 20th century, but that doesn't make it any less more right, wrong, condemnable, what have you. But I wanted to bring it to a U.S. example because I want to stress one of the main theories of why not kill them all, which is that no people, no culture is really immune to being the perpetrator or the victim of these acts. And I've been talking so much about, the Nazis, the Soviets, and other groups, that I've wanted to stress in this podcast that, one of the main things that they offer, we mentioned in the first episode, is that no one is immune to this. This happens in every walk of human life, where we can all be perpetrator or victim at any point throughout our history. No one's immune to it. So this idea that we just don't do that is just not factual, right? That no one is the exception to this rule that mass killing and organized killing of people can happen and does happen throughout history. So to kind of bring it to, I've talked about frenzy killings earlier. Group behavior plays a role in getting people to commit these acts as well. We just kind of, to put a bow on the idea of organization getting you to do this. Organization can also play on group behavior as well. You kind of see this at riots, at sports games sometimes. A little bit of a lighter touch in this discussion. But group behavior plays a huge role in genocides and mass killings. The SS, for example, and the Einsatzgruppen and groups like that, you often can research and learn that these guys formed a tight bond of brotherhood in what they were doing and their legitimacy of it, that it seems like a justifiable act too because that guy's doing it too. It's also okay because he's doing it, I'm doing it. I mean, we get down to the basics. I always like to bring it back to education and your average school building. Group behavior is noticeable at all levels of human life. It seems okay and justifiable if one person can do it or another. The Rwandan Genocide, I haven't talked much about this one, committed slaughter on a very wide scale over a short period of time. The Rwandan Genocide is well known for having a large death toll, probably near 1 million, plus or minus what have you. The numbers are really hard to determine in that one. But it was a short frame of time that these killings happened over. And people have always been, how are they able to do that? How did this large number of killing over, I believe it was a few months to about a year. I could be wrong on that. I'll have to check that up a little bit here in a minute, maybe by the end of the episode, and I'll correct it if I'm wrong in the third episode. But slaughter on this large scale over a short period of time because you had the Interhuame, forgive me if I mispronounce that, but very close-knit organization similar to your SS, your Einsatzgruppen, that they helped legitimize the killing of group behavior of average people. That when you add that backbone, Chirot and McCauley going more in depth in this than I will, but if you legitimize that behavior with a backbone organization like the Interahamwe in Rwanda, you can then take group behavior, put it on a larger scale to commit more violent acts. You can get average citizens to kill their own neighbors. And you see this lots of times in history. You see this all the time, and largely in frenzy killing. I'm going to get into some more examples that you're able to get neighbors to kill people they know, people that they understand, if you can provide the organizational backbone. And they called it, like I said, quick frenzy killings. And they actually use a term for it that I think is useful called Proto Genocides. Again, bring it back to the emotions of fear, anger, moral wrongs. I know we probably sound like a broken record, but these things are so powerful that I feel it's necessary to remind people of, and they can motivate people to kill in very large numbers by category. The proto-genocides that they offer up, they usually subside quicker because of the lack of organization. Like I said, if you look at the burning of Black Wall Street, other African-American atrocities in the United States, lynchings, there's your group mentality right there. If you don't have the organization behind it to sustain over long periods of time, these proto-genocides, the author calls them, can kind of fade away. And I mentioned before I got into the proto-genocides about how do you get neighbors to kill their own neighbors. Besides organization, we're drawing to the end here, there's some other pieces as well. Back to Eastern Europe, one of the most brutalized regions in the 20th century between the Soviet Union and Germany, killing on large scales during turmoil and war leads people, average people, to violence. The brutalization of groups of people can lead them to do some really awful things. Again, the authors don't offer this as an excuse, it's just a reason it can happen. In Poland and the Ukraine and other territories of Eastern Europe, when the Germans come in and the SS arrives, the Einsatzgruppen, oftentimes when this happens, you'll have groups of people commit violent acts against Jewish populations without being asked by the Einsatzgruppen or the SS or other, groups of people. A large portion of that plays on anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe that had been there for a long time. It was not exclusive to, Germany during World War II. The Soviet Union and Russia before that had been known for, their pogroms against Jewish populations. So that wasn't anything new, but the fact that this region had been so brutalized by war, famine in the Ukraine's case, definitely put people in a situation to commit awful acts. This is an analogy that, I like to think of and use for students. If you look at the show The Walking Dead, when you remove the barriers of the quote-unquote civilization or law and order, what will people do? How will they react? And then when you add violence to that equation and less law and order for a time, how will people react? And that's kind of the analogy that I take from Chirot and McCauley, talking about this idea of, the brutalization of people will lead them to more violence. And you see that in human behavior quite a bit. Violence, again, I talked about it earlier in the show, can breed more violence in an individual's life, not just even on a large scale of people. So to kind of put an ending on how do you get people to commit these awful acts of violence over periods of time, because as it's been well established, humans have a natural aversion to killing and mass killing, especially over long periods of time. It seems to me that this equation or mix of fear, justice, I've been wronged and I need to commit a wrong, orders from a legitimate authority, a bond between people in committing those acts that provides legitimacy, that continues to enforce those emotions that I just mentioned. And the final key piece of organization all leads humans into being able to commit these awful acts throughout history. And then when you add the brutalization piece, when you add the violence piece between groups of people over a long period of time, for example, like the frontier with Native Americans in the United States or troops serving in the Philippine conflict, these kinds of behaviors are going to happen on whatever scale have you with the people involved with industrialized nations. And I want to close kind of with a brighter side of this whole thing. And I took that class in college on politics of genocide, and we read a book called, it's now a Netflix film, I encourage you to go check it out, called First They Killed My Father by Luong. Sorry if I mispronounced that as well. And there was a quote by her that always stuck with me about this kind of stuff. And she says that, "I think how the world is still somehow beautiful, even when I feel no joy at being alive within it." And that is her reflecting on her time during the Cambodian genocide, which is what First They Killed My Father was about, in Cambodia, when Pol Pot took over and began his process of eliminating intellectuals, certainly different categories there than ethnic groups, anyone who was a threat to his ideological society of utopian, like going back to the agrarian ways and getting rid of intellectualism and kind of getting rid of industrialized life and getting back to the old agrarian status of things. And, intellectuals provided pollution to that. And Luong's father was an example that he was an intellectual, I believe he was a teacher. And the story of the people that get through these things, I think is, and I mentioned this in the first episode, is what I've always been gravitated to. And I think, maybe some of us are attracted to the awful side of genocide. But when you find the pieces of light inside of all of this, when you find the harrowing stories of people who get through it, like Luong, like Elie Wiesel, when you find people who make it through all these things, it gives us hope, I think. I think we all want to believe that the humans, us as a species, are going to get better, that we're going to improve, that we're going to become better people than our ancestors have. It's always our hope that we make the next generation better than what we had, and we always improve and we always move forward. I think when we look back and see things like this, genocides and mass killings, we want to believe that we're going to be better. How we get there is a different story, and Chirot and McCauley offer examples of how to, avoid mass killing and genocides. They offer up things like international law, which we certainly already have. The biggest one they offer is the proper education of this stuff, which is why, we as a department talked about making this podcast and doing this research, possibly offering a genocide course on the various genocides throughout history and even more modern ones, and, even things like Proto Genocides. By proper education, hopefully students and humans can recognize these signs of genocide, the organizations that are trying to promote the conditions of it, recognize this stuff before it happens. I think we're much better at that today than we have been in the past, but still, the dark side of it is that these things are probably going to still happen. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to get better. It doesn't mean that it's inevitable. The education piece, I think, is big. And they also talk about, the benefits of economic trade and globalization, hopefully leading to the decrease of this, that we're trying to detribalize after the 20th century instead of continuing to retribalize in the 21st century. So hopefully that process continues. And they leave the book off on a good note, that there is hope, and that through proper education, through detribalization, through proper trade and globalization, maybe we can overcome and be better and avoid things like this in the future. So their work is great to understand the conditions of mass killing and how do we prevent them. And then the final piece is these events, these awful events and awful acts throughout history deserve to be remembered. They deserve our attention. They deserve our thoughts. And, because there are people still alive to this day that have gone through this. Rwanda was only in the 90s, So, this is stuff that people have to focus on, have to understand, have to remember. Because the first step of avoiding things like this in the future is to know the past and how it fits into the human story and the human narrative. So we have come to the end of our series on genocide here in this episode. We will have a part 3 coming out next month, hopefully. In the part 3, you are not going to be hearing just from me, hopefully. Yes, there will be other people involved in the project, hoping to get some students from some of the classes that we've had on world wars and different things into the studio with me and maybe other teachers. They've heard that we were doing an episode on genocide, and after the first episode came out, I was like, what about us? Can you bring us in? So I said, yeah, I'll pack my research that I was going to do into part 2 and part 3 into just part 2, and then we can have kind of a sit-down table round discussion on genocide and, talk and have some back and forth and discussions about the 2 episodes that we just did, and sort of some of their thoughts and feelings on, genocide and how it should be taught, how they learned it, how they think it should be remembered, how to prevent it in the future, which genocides they've studied the most, which ones they are most fascinated by. So I thank you for listening to this part 2 in our series on genocide. Please subscribe to the page. We're still trying to, get us up in those subscribers. We hope you enjoyed this show, and please continue to listen, and thank you for the support.